today for this wonderful event. If people want to start coming in, sitting down, it would be great.
Oh,
Okay, so we're still kind of in reception mode, but I want to welcome everybody here to this very special event tonight. East End Books is happy to welcome everybody to this very special event with the authors Julia Glass and Tom Perrotta. We will have signed book, extra signed books for each of the authors if you were not able to come tonight. And they'll be available for you to get. You can order them on the website. And then if you're here in Boston, our store isn't open yet, but we can get that to you if you buy it on the website. And if you want to do store pickup, you can there's a drop-down menu, and it'll be me basically arranging to meet you to get the book. You can also have them delivered, and we'll get those signed copies to you. So just a couple of announcements. First, I want to thank Kristen Canty, who is also serving as a tech person right now, getting the live stream, the owner of Woodsville Pier 4 Restaurant, my favorite restaurant, located right here in this building, 300 Pier 4, and also the residents and management of 300 Pier 4 Boulevard. We want to thank all of them for allowing us to use this lovely event space. Second, I'd like to let you know that our next event is on September 27th. It will also be in this event space, which is at the second floor of the building. You enter through the lobby. And this special event features authors Coleman Foote, with her new book Coleman Hill, and Asaka Serizawa, whose book is out called Inheritance, another brilliant book. Coleman Hill is just coming out, and it will be available shortly. Third, I want to update everybody on our new Boston store. Our contractor has informed us that the build-out of the store will be complete by the end of October. Tremont is construction is saying Halloween, so we are looking forward to that. We're happy to announce also that the Mass Development Corporation has selected us to participate in the Biz Empower program through patronicity.com. So we have a short amount of time, basically to the end of this month, to raise $20,000. And if we do that, well, my mother would say, when we do that, it will unlock a grant of $40,000 to us. So that's matching funds, so that'll mean $60,000 that will go towards the construction downstairs of the bookstore. So we're very excited about that. If you're interested in that, you can see a link on our website or a link on our Instagram page. And also, I neglected it's over there. You can see that. You can check that out. We appreciate it. So I'm thrilled to introduce our special guest tonight. Julia Glass is the author of 6 previous books of fiction, including the best-selling 3 Junes, winner of the National Book Award, and I See You Everywhere, winner of Binghamton University's John Gardner Fiction Book Award. Recipient of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the New York Foundation for the Arts, and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. Glass is a senior distinguished writer in residence at Emerson College. She lives with her family north of Boston. I'm excited to be working with Julie, to make a limited series based on 3 Junes, the critically acclaimed National Book Award winner. Tom Perrotta is the best-selling author of 10 works of fiction, including Election and Little Children, both of which were made into critically acclaimed movies, and The Leftovers and Mrs. Fletcher, which were both adapted into HBO series. He lives outside Boston. Julia's book, of course, new book, it's out on paperback now, is Vigil Harbor, and Tom's book is, of course, Tracy Flick Can't Win. And so Vigil Harbor, from the National Book Award-winning best-selling author 3 Junes, comes an engrossing, richly drawn, and exquisitely told story of small-town residents grappling with the difficulties of changing times. And J. Courtney Sullivan, the author of Friends and Strangers, says it's full of secrets and surprises, a must-read. Tracy Flick Can't Win is soon to be a major motion picture starring Reese Witherspoon. Tom Perrotta is one of the great writers that we have today. I love his book, and this is from Harlan. Oh. And it's an engrossing and mordantly funny novel about ambition, coming of age, and adulthood, and never really leaving high school politics behind, featuring New York Times bestselling author Tom Perrotta's most iconic character of all time. So we're thrilled to welcome both of them for this conversation tonight. Thank you.
Hey, Tom.
Julie.
Jeff, thank you so much. I have a very soft spot in my heart for a lot of booksellers, but Jeff is really a superstar. And I'd like to urge everybody to contribute to the Patronicity campaign to help support the Boston branch of East End Bookshop in Provincetown. Thank you. So.
And I will second that. This is a beautiful neighborhood, and the city needs more bookstores.
It does. It's kind of, isn't it sort of a wonder that Boston, which is sort of education central, it has some pretty great bookstores, but not as many as you would think.
It's true. The suburbs actually,
I know.
so it's full of bookstores, and I think the city needs to catch up.
Yes, absolutely. And also thank you to my students from Emerson College who have largely populated the audience. And thank you to everybody out there on the live stream, with a special shout out to Kevin Arnold, my student writer in California, who is attending. Hey, Kevin.
Hey, Kevin. Might as well jump on the bandwagon.
So did we think about how we're going to actually do this?
I don't think we did discuss it, but we're going to have a conversation, and one thing I think it's important when we have these conversations is to just at least make sure that, like, if we start talking about characters' names, for instance, that at least the viewers kind of know a little about the book. So maybe we should each just talk a little bit about the books.
Oh, okay.
Or not, or...
No, we shouldn't.
Well, I mean, I love Vigil Harbor, and it just struck me. So this is a book about a dystopian America that looks very much like the America that we live in. Just heightened around, climate crisis, post-pandemic, feelings of vulnerability, social breakdown. And I think what was interesting was that you are also drawing a portrait of a small, relatively sheltered community, and it's sort of both local and global. And it turns out to be, I think, to cover a lot of ground, both in its in the way that the wider world impacts the place you call Vigil Harbor, and just in the spectrum of characters that you have in the book.
Well, and you too. I mean, I think we corresponded briefly about how both of our books are very densely populated microcosms. And in your case, it's the society of a high school, of a public high school. And you and I have children in our 20s, but we both went through being a part of that kind of a community. And what a gift, and also what a nest of vipers that can be. And your story kind of foregrounds, it's just in the wake of #MeToo and the period during which schools were beginning to uncover all kinds of inappropriate teacher-student relationships in their past and atone for that. It's about the microcosm of power in a school system, and Tom and I both live in pretty affluent suburbs of Boston. I think I can have us that way. And so my novel is Vigil Harbor, the fictional town of my novel, is pretty nakedly based on Marblehead, which is a coastal town north of Boston that happens to have 5 yacht clubs, by the way. Very privileged town in which, as my husband likes to say, diversity is represented by brunettes. The story is set well, when I wrote it, it was 12 years in the future. So it's actually, if you do the math, it doesn't say, it's set in 2034. And it's not like me to go futuristic. For one thing, I'm not even very savvy about technology now, so I certainly am not writing science fiction. I imagine a few things that are slightly different. But it's really about what the social and political pressures are, what I imagine they might be in a dozen years, how much more, how the volume's been turned up on political polarity, on immigration policy, on reproductive policy, and I was writing this before our current political climate, but mostly about global warming and the effect of climate change. Not just climate change itself, but activism around climate change. In fact, the town, I mean, when you say it's dystopian, I always like to say that the world of my novel is very recognizable in terms of, the world has not become, or rather this town is not a crater in the ground. Everybody still has electricity and power and they drive around in cars, but the notion that a privileged town like this can remain immune from the political forces of the world at large, that's what's come under threat. And we're both, I mean, we can talk about this in more detail, but when I read Tracy Flick Kent, one of the things that immediately struck me is I think I've bitten off a lot in my novel with 8 points of view, 8 characters narrating the novel, plus an omniscient point of view, but it's baby steps compared to yours. Do you know how many points of view there are in Tracy?
It's probably not more than...
It's like 15 or 16, and yet I could keep them all straight.
Okay.
It's not, I was amazed.
Well, the interesting thing, and this is why I was saying that I think your microcosm is bigger than mine. Not that size of microcosms matter, but I think my story focused very intently on this one issue, which was that in the high school where Tracy Flick is the assistant principal, they just started this Hall of Fame, and so there are two focuses. One is Tracy wants to become the principal because the new principal is retiring, but the other is she's on a committee that is going to select who is going to be honored by the high school, and these are 2 issues that matter to Tracy. One is her ability to advance in the world, because she's a very ambitious person who feels the call to leadership and feels pretty thwarted literally by the patriarchy around her. And also is, I think, mystified by what seems to her the injustice of how fame is distributed in the culture. And so it has a kind of narrow focus, and so there are a lot of characters. So the way that I organize the narrators, all the first-person narrators are on the committee that is selecting people for the Hall of Fame, and the characters who are discussed in third person are generally people who are being considered for the Hall of Fame. So it does have, in that sense, a kind of narrow organizing principle, which is what I learned from Election. Election, I wanted to write a political novel, but was
when you wrote Election.
So this is back in 30 years ago. This we can talk about what it means to be a writer who's been writing for 30 years.
I brought back a couple of characters from an earlier novel in this one too. It's not so much a sequel.
Yeah, and I wanted to write a political novel, but I realized I don't know anything about politics that anybody who doesn't read the paper, I never worked in a political campaign. I never knew a politician very intimately, and and just in a kind of frustrated way, I said, my only political experiences. I was twice the homeroom representative. And
I didn't even get that far in school politics.
well, I had the charisma, you know. And it was like, that was like a little light bulb, the writer's light bulb went off. It was like, oh, okay, if I could write, you know, everything I know about politics, but keep it, you know, within the realm of a high school, that would be fun. That would be like a kind of a counterintuitive achievement, you know, and especially then to have someone like Tracy who already felt like too big for the high school. You know, that her ambition was too big for the space she was confined in, like a kind of comic energy. And that has become something that I've really thought about as a writer, like how small can I make the story and still have it kind of have an allegorical largeness, so that you can feel like, oh, this dynamic seems like a dynamic that applies in the wider world.
Yeah. You know, I think another thing that our books have in common is that they're both satirical but serious at the same time. Because I think, I mean, I'm certainly aware of living in the kind of community that I do, which I'm looking at in my novel, that it's astonishing how easy so much is. And the things people complain about, I mean, the cliche is first world problems, right? But I also live in a town where the biggest drama that takes place politically in the town has to do with the school committee and the superintendent. I mean, our superintendent drama actually made the front page of the Boston Globe last week. The superintendent who's been fired and nobody knows why. We didn't even get to the bottom of it. So, but the other thing is that we are, and I know this from your other books too, we write about domestic relationships. We write about husbands and wives and parents and children. And we both write about, this is something that I always say my favorite stories are about really smart, good-hearted people who make really foolish choices. And then how do they deal with the consequences? Or not deal with the consequences, and what are the consequences of not dealing with the consequences? And there's so much of that in your book and in mine. But both of our books also, the lion's share of the stories are about these families and friends and neighbors in this very tight community. And both of our stories come to a very dramatic, unexpected climax. In fact, the way in which, and I'm not going to give away anything, the way in which you handled point of view, and as a writer I read very conscious of first person versus third person, by the end I understood why that was. It had to do with the climax. But what emerges is that both of these suburban communities are not at all immune to the kind of violence that we see in the world at large.
Yeah, well, let's say two things. One is, you know, the superintendent drama that seems small in your town actually is also bad enough, has to do, but in national politics right now, you know, the entire state of Virginia basically, you know, went red over, you know, parental rights and what kind of curriculum about, you know, race or gender is going to be taught in public schools. Like that is like right at the heart of American politics right now. And I don't know if this is the case in your school, but also, you know, misbehavior by teachers in the way school districts cover it up, you know, so that yeah, in my book there's Tracy's reflecting on a sexual relationship she had with a teacher when she was in high school herself, and thinking about it through the lens that she had then, which was, I'm a young woman who can has agency in the world, and these boys are not worth my time, and this teacher is my only peer, and that was how she looked at it in the 1990s. But now, in the post-Me Too world, she's got this other narrative that she's grappling with. She doesn't like it because it puts her in a position of victim, and she's always been very clear, like, I did what I did, and then I stopped it when I decided it wasn't good, and and she sort of, like, it happened, and I moved on. But now, because, she has to grapple with this other narrative, I got a little off my subject, which was a response to what you were saying before. Let me just say this, I was a little surprised when you called Vigil Harbor satirical, only because I think that as soon as the character Brecht is introduced, and he's so clearly been traumatized. So he's a young
20s.
Yeah, so college age guy who has been affected by this climate violence.
Right. There's been an increase in, I don't know if you can really say small-scale terrorism. I mean, terrorism is terrorism, but there are terrorist acts connected with climate activism in the world that I'm depicting. And Brecht, this 20-something, has come home to Vigil Harbor after having been in New York City and narrowly escaped, survived a terrorist act that did kill a number of people, and was trying to pull himself back together, and his parents, of course, are concerned about him. So that's you're right, I mean, that's a very serious aspect to it, but there's also the yacht club, component where there's this couple in the middle of this scandalous, embarrassing divorce, who's, two couples where the husband of one and the wife of the other run away together to a survivalist commune in northern Wisconsin, leaving their two spouses to be utterly humiliated before the yacht club in Vigil Harbor. So, and I thought there was a lot of comedy there. And also, she is the one who's left by her husband is this very kind of saucy, foul-mouthed, retired English teacher from the high school. So there's a little bit of
there definitely is. There is that, and I think it creates a kind of emotional off-balance quality for the reader. It's almost as if because I think there is this sense of like really dark forces pressing in on this community, and there is a way in which those small dramas seem even smaller in a way, but they're also, on the other hand, this is what happens in times of crisis, like these units that are stable sort of break up, and so I think it did remind me, especially you have like the italicized.
This sort of bird's eye view, the kind of omniscient interludes that look down on this community from a kind of God's eye
It
view.
felt that very Cheeverish to me, like maybe like look like Bullet Park or something like that. And Cheever, of course, all loved to write about affairs at the yacht club. But again, I think it's sort of within this context that feels charged and dark, and so it, and I like, I mean, satire always seems to me like can be limiting for a writer, because it sort of assumes like, well, we're above the characters and we're sort of poking at them, But I think the characters feel unmoored in a really good way. Like I'm reading the book and I'm not sure like what's going to happen, and I just feel like a kind of a sense of dread, even though people are continuing on with their lives. And even when you have a character who is an architect who's become famous, for him it's like the changing climate is a business opportunity.
Right. He's building houses to withstand these increasingly violent storms in their coastal community.
Yeah. So no, I wouldn't say it was a bad thing that the book didn't feel satirical. I like that it feels so that there's this kind of undercurrent of dread.
Well, there is, and I will say this. I mean, I don't know about how thoroughly you plot out books, but I sort of write forward in the dark. And one of the difficulties that I had with this book, which really took me a lot longer in getting traction on than any of my other books. In fact, I took a break from it to write my 6th book, A House Among the Trees, and then came back to it and wondered if I was going to abandon it or resume. And And actually, I had been going to write the whole book in an omniscient voice, and I realized, no, I wanted it to be very intimate, character to character. But one of the hardest things was, in what order should I introduce the characters? I mean, the present activity of the novel, the present story, takes place over less than a week, and comes to a climax because of not one but two strangers who come to town, each with a sort of secret agenda, and they kind of collide and affect all of these people that you've met. But what I could not have guessed before I really started to gain momentum on the novel was that Brecht, this traumatized 20-year-old, would become such a major character, and that he would essentially have the first and almost the last word in the novel. I'm actually, and by the way, I love Lily and who's the other student? There are two students.
Oh, Nate.
And Nate, two students who of course get to help decide on this Hall of Fame. And they're fabulous characters, especially Nate. I really loved him. And so you get this real age range in your book too. But I don't know about you, but I am very intimidated by writing about people much younger than me. I'm not at all afraid of people much older than me, and that's been true for a long time. But that I gave Brecht so much stature in this book. And his story is sad. I think it's hopeful ultimately, but it's you know, especially if you're a parent and you read about this kid, you're pretty concerned about where he's headed. So that was a real surprise to me. Did you have characters that surprised you by becoming more important than you'd anticipated?
Yeah, I mean, I think that always happens, and I'm like you, I don't have a plot in my mind. I did have a sense early on that everyone's going to converge at a particular event, and that's where things are going to happen. So that's, I don't just write in the dark. I do think I have a sense of like, okay, what's my question and where will you know, but I didn't figure out what was going to happen until quite late in the process. But yeah, like somebody like Nate, I had absolutely no sense of who that character was at the beginning. In a sense, he was there to almost trigger Tracy, because Nate and Lily are the president and vice president of the student body. And you know, Tracy did become president at the end of the election, but for a second, because the election was fraudulent, for a second, Paul was elected in spite of the fact that Tracy actually won. And so she has this deeply ingrained sense of failure and injustice around this moment when she thought she lost. And she thinks Lily, this young woman, is far superior to Nate. She's smarter and she's you know, a more effective leader, but she lost. And so Tracy really looks at her and sees like that's somebody who is a kind of a devil, or somebody who just reminds her of her younger self. And Nate is this sort of privileged guy who, you know, like a lot of men in Tracy's world, got the prize without really deserving it.
So he's kind of, you know, I like him because, you know, he's kind of like, whoa, how did I get here? He's not the football captain, he's just like this in the mirror.
Well, yeah. It's sort of funny, because I was actually thinking about this relating to Barbie and this movie Bottoms that just came out.
Is that good?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's I Owe It Berry from The Bear, and Rachel Sennett, who's in a movie called Shiva Baby, that I think is really good. But in both of them, I was just so struck. It's a peculiar moment in feminism, especially post Me Too, where in Me Too I think there were these like really nasty male villains. You know, there were Harvey Weinstein and just
you know, powerful. The first page of your novel begins kind of
those guys
summarizing this moment.
This summer, like the feminism has imagined a patriarchy that seems quite pathetic, Like the Kens are, you know, they're cute. Even when they install a patriarchy, it doesn't seem that bad really, and nobody seems unhappy about it really, except the, you know, the people who came from the real world. But in Bottoms too, there's this football team that like runs the high school up there. It's the gayest football team that you've ever seen, you know. And in the end, like the feminists, you know, the tough girls who've learned to fight, you know, have to fight to protect the football team. And so it's like a really like interesting crisis in, I don't know if it's a crisis in feminism, it's just a funny moment where, you know, it almost seems like that moment when the villains of Me Too have been maybe, you know, caged up.
Mediated or so.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because maybe we're sort of in a post Me Too moment, because I think right post Me Too we thought, okay, now we're getting somewhere, you know, justice. And then, you know, I mean, not that the biggest villains there have really come back. I mean, wasn't there supposed to be some comeback for Charlie Rose, and then I don't think that happened.
Yeah, I think he's kind of, I haven't heard anything
No,
about him.
there were sort of rumors that, or Matt Lauer.
Yeah, I mean, Louis C.K. has come back, but on his, you know, it's sort of in this definitely diminished way, but he kind of, but he does have an audience still, you know.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, he's in no way the figure that he was beforehand. You know, and then there are other people who were occupying more gray zone, like Aziz Ansari or some other people. Yeah, I was just sort of struck by the sort of the idea that the patriarchy was identified as the villain in these two movies, but it's like a comic version of the patriarchy.
Yeah.
And I don't know, you know, I mean, these movies are both comedies, and so maybe it makes sense. Maybe like a comedy can't fully encompass like the darkness of you know, a real patriarchy that was intent on keeping women down. You know, I don't know, but it did strike me that.
Well, you know, Barbie, it's actually funny because I hate to say this, but I've had Ken's power ballad stuck in my head a lot lately. Sorry, but, and my God, I have to say, Ryan Gosling is unbelievably funny. I wasn't a huge fan of his. I saw it a second, I was sort of compelled to see it a second time. I was with a friend and she said, we have to go, and I'm like, fine, I'll see it a second time. And I thought the pleasure of this is all I'm going to do is watch Ryan Gosling's face. And it was just so But the thing is, he's not a villain, he's just a doofus. You know, so there's this, if you could look at the patriarchy as some cabal of doofuses, I mean, maybe that would be just as bad as you know, a cabal of abusers.
Well, it actually does seem to be another narrative that is at large in this moment. You know, I just saw the Times did their Sunday magazine about a bunch of stories about college, and one of them was that there's essentially affirmative action for men, because if schools just had like a single standard for admission, it would be like 60-40 for women. That men essentially get like, you know,
they get special allowance.
Well, right, because admissions committees are actually saying like they're imposing a kind of implicit quota, like we want to get close to 50-50,
right.
Because if the gender imbalance gets too big, it actually, there's a belief, and the writer pointed out, like it's not necessarily evidence-based, but there's a sense that the school would be less desirable both to men and women if the imbalance were such that they were.
But the other thing is, I think that the percentage of applicants of men is going down.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think they use Tulane as an example. The latest class in Tulane is, I mean, maybe it's not 60% women, but it's something
close.
like that.
It's close. And you know, and you know, Roger Reeves just put out this book. You know, I don't remember the title, but it's about all of the problems that
American
boys
masculinity.
are and
I heard a great interview.
yeah, and so there is a sense of men being, you know, beleaguered and in some sense struggling, you know, to make their way in a world that's still, you know, visibly a patriarchy, but but maybe not a thriving, you know, to take the patriarch's view, maybe not a patriarchy that's functioning like one might expect, you know. And so it is sort of interesting. I think it is a kind of maybe is part of what makes feminism so uncertain right now. You know, it's like our who is exactly the enemy, and you know, because in many ways women are seem to be like really thriving in this particular moment. Now they're not being elected president, and they're not running a lot of companies.
Do you know, I heard a really interesting figure on NPR the other day. It was a piece about the two women who are running for president of Mexico, one of whom will probably win, and what a large percentage of the legislative body in Mexico is women. And the guy who was addressing this said to the interviewer, in a ranking, a worldwide ranking of countries where you look at what percentage of women are in the legislative body, do you know where the United States ranks?
I heard that, yeah. Like
71st. 71st. We have only, our legislative body has only 28% women. And you know, Mexico, the head of the Supreme Court is woman, and I was blown away by that. I didn't think we would be in the top 5, but I was really, so the patriarchy is a lot.
Yeah, no, that is a good, it's such an interesting thing. So at that level, and especially our politics is geriatric, as we know, right? It's literally like old men.
So you're that Mitt Romney in saying he's not going to run again said that both Biden and Trump are too old.
So that's true. So it's a very interesting thing. Like, you know, maybe this patriarchy will continue to reproduce itself. On the other hand, it feels like there's a lot of energy among young women. They're thriving in academia. They're entering I feel like the medical profession, which when I was growing up was almost women doctors were pretty rare when I was growing up, and now it's a 50-50 thing. I mean, and something like that, right? It's medical schools for sure are now
Really?
actually majority women, a lot of them. So, you know, but again, that is another, you know, quote unquote caring profession. You know, and it does seem like, you know, women often be social or
Politicians should be. That should be a caring profession.
Yes.
Not so much.
You think?
Yeah. So, and I'm really, and have always been in my novels, drawn to writing male characters. But I like to think that the women I write, that they're always very strong women. And I really, you know, this character that I have, Margot, who is the retired high school teacher in this novel, in a way, I won't say she was my favorite character, but she was the most fun to be with, because she's just totally outspoken. And you know, she takes this sad sack guy who's her husband left for his wife, and she just pulls him up by the lapels. I mean, they're not romantically involved. She's determined to sort of get him out of his sort of mopey slump and make something of him. But Brecht, you know, and Brecht is this fragile, but also a character who in the end takes on a lot of agency and goes out and does something very risky. And I was surprised by that, but also, you know, kind of gratified by it. Do you have characters that you worry about and care about more than others? Because I found that while I was writing Vigil Harbor, as Brecht became more prominent, it's also that I felt like I was very concerned about him. I didn't know how I was going to bring him to a conclusion, but I thought I can't have him fall down. And how I'm going to do that in a plausible way was one of the biggest challenges for me. Did you feel that way about I mean, Tracy certainly is someone who I was very worried about how she was going to come to a hopeful ending.
Yeah, and I, you know, I think, well, that's different, because I think Tracy, you know, I did, at first, when I was writing Election at the beginning, I don't think I understood, you know, that she was going to be the really lasting character in this story. I was much more focused on Mr. M and his dilemma. You know, Tracy was there almost as a foil. And So I just had the very strange experience of, you know, I was lucky enough to have this movie made, and then Bruce Witherspoon just gave this iconic performance, and it entered like the cultural bloodstream in a
Well, so did Matthew Broderick.
Kind of, but nobody, you know, Mr. M isn't like a phrase you can just, oh, he's
Well,
Mr. M, right? Nobody
yeah,
knows what that
no.
means, so you just say she's a Tracy Flick. People know, you know, and I would, you know, be driving around in my car, you know, and actually hear like some, you know, newscaster say something, you know, oh, well, Hillary is seen as a sort of a Tracy Flick, you know.
That's awesome.
It is, and so it, you know, and then there was a whole moment when, like, feminist critics kind of reflected on Tracy and said, wait a second, why is she the villain? She's just this high school girl who was like preyed on by her teacher, and now she's trying to, you know, be elected president and to get a scholarship because, you know, she has a single mom who can't afford, you know, and it was like a really interesting thing to watch, like the culture come to grips with this character in a new way, and as part of the reason why I wrote the book was to kind of, you know, to re-enter this discussion of Tracy, but also to think like, what would Tracy think about the way, you know, the world has changed, and the way that we talk about ambitious women has changed, and the way we talk about, you know, power imbalances in school has changed. Like how does Tracy tell her story now? That was, and so there definitely was some worry, but, you know, it's that funny thing when you write. I like what you just said about, you know, discovering to your surprise, A, that Brecht is an important character, and B, that you kind of care about him in such a way that you can't allow something really bad to happen to him. Because I think those are some mysterious things that happen when you live in the novel for a while.
I mean, not that, you know, I mean, we kill people off. We portray injustice as well as justice, or we wouldn't be writing, you know, fiction that would be interesting. But there are some lines you can't cross. I mean, you sort of.
But you don't know what they are, right?
Until you get there, right? I mean, so, you know, this is not the first novel in which I've wondered who, if anybody, is going to die. Will somebody die? And really sit back and think about it. You know, very early on, you know, after I published my first novel, 3 Junes, I had the incredible fortune of getting to be kind of the opening band at 2 events for Richard Russo just after he won the Pulitzer Prize for Empire Falls. And he was so generous to me. So he was exhausted. He was on like this 15-city tour, and, you know, I was like, and yet he went out to dinner with me both nights, and I grilled him because I had read Empire Falls and loved it. And, you know, I don't think there's, at this point in time, I'm doing him a disservice by saying that there's a school shooting in Empire Falls. And one of the questions I asked him, I said, when you wrote that scene, which is a shock when you get to it, did you know who would die? And he said, no. And I said, had you thought that the young female protagonist might die? And he said, yes. And then he started to cry. Probably because he was really tired and needed to get back to his hotel. But I sat there like, oh my God, I've like made Richard Russo cry. And he said she was so much of her was based on my daughter. He said, and I also thought, and this was really interesting, he said, in a way, he said, you can break the reader's heart, but there are certain things you cannot do to your reader. And I thought, this I cannot do to the reader, let alone the character. And I've always thought about that. You know, I mean, certainly there are writers who will, you know, torture the reader and break the reader's heart. And every, you know, we know who those people are, and sometimes we're up for that. But, you know, I've had people yell at me for killing off certain characters or not having them end in a certain way that they wanted them to end, like people ending together rather than divorced or whatever. But I don't think I've committed any high crimes in that respect, and I don't want to. So.
Yeah, I was just interested in hearing you say that, because I do think those are the moments when the book becomes the book, you know, and when you define yourself as the writer of this book. And I definitely was very worried about that. And was not so much worried about his physical health, but his
mental health. Well, he's,
you know.
yeah, he's in a tough place.
Yeah, and there, yeah, I don't want to spoil anything there, but yeah, I think, what was I going to ask you? Yeah, I felt, you know, that I didn't think there was a single truly unreliable narrator in your book. I felt your characters were telling the truth as best they could.
I mean, some of them might have been fooling themselves about themselves in a way. I mean, Mike is kind of a bit of a sad sack, although I love Mike, the guy that Margot's trying to shake into, you know, out of his.
And Petra has an agenda, but we know that she
Petra's
has.
one of the strangers that comes from out of town. She has sort of a mission of vengeance.
Yes, and we know that. So
yes, we know it right.
So we see, you know, what she's up to, but we at least know why she's up to it, which I think is you know, so you understand her. I mean, she seems misguided for sure.
Well, it's interesting. So, you know, there is a kind of, there are always secrets, right? I mean, I think, I used to be ashamed, sort of, that, oh God, here's another secret in this novel. But I mean, I think that's, you know, we all have secrets, and I think a lot of fiction is about the hiding and the uncovering of secrets. So this successful architect who lives in Vigil Harbor and builds these fabulous houses has a past when he was a young architect in New York, and this, when I talk about foolish choices, he had a very passionate, impulsive relationship with a young woman who was incredibly, you know, creative and sensual. I mean, he was completely enthralled to this young woman, and he went too deep into that relationship, and then that relationship ended very badly. And she presented herself to him as an otherworldly creature, as, you know, Stealthy or mermaid, as an underwater creature. And again, here I felt like, whoa, this is kind of out of my depths, no pun intended. But you find out that Petra, who's come to sort of track down Austin, the architect, after all these years, was also in love with that young woman, who kind of, and so, but she believed very fervently that the way in which Isa, that young woman, presented herself was true. So Austin felt like, oh my God, I got involved with someone who was clearly unhinged and had to separate himself. And they believe different things, but you want to know something, you know, different people who read this book early on believe different things. Like my editor believes the opposite of what, you know, I believe, well, I'm not going to say what I think the truth is, but my editor believed the opposite. And when that became clear, I was like, oh, really? And she's like, yes. And I'm like, okay, so you could believe Petra or you could believe Austin, and then they confront each other with their versions of what happened in the past toward the end of the book. And that's, you know, another thing that happens.
So, I mean, that's a real, yeah, that's a very interesting part of this book, because it's a bit of a noir setup, right? It's like somebody comes into your life under false pretenses. She claims to be a journalist,
Interviewing for a documentary.
you know, but she's really, you know, sees herself as a romantic rival, even though there's no romantic rivalry now.
I mean, it was a long time ago.
But I love the same person you did, and in some sense you took her away.
Yeah, she believes that he had really quite a nefarious influence on the fate.
Right. And then there's, as you say, there's this possibly supernatural
It's like me, but yeah.
overlay. You know, so that's a very complicated, interesting story that you're telling there, in the midst of, you know, this other story, which is about this community under threat from terrorism. So it's an expansive book in that sense. I think I may believe what your editor believes.
Oh, good. You know, I always say, you know, it's like that saying, the customer is always right. I say, you know, that's right. Yeah, you're right.
Just met somebody last night who said, I just read the back of your book. I had no idea that Tracy was a woman.
Did they know anything about elections?
Oh, I didn't get into it. I just like, okay. Let me clear that up. You're not always right.
Well, we are gonna have worthy delusions. So I don't know, should we open it up for questions?
Sure, I mean, this is,
Although-
there's probably a lot of questions, especially
I know,
if
but
we delved into Barbie and bottoms as well as everything
I know, and
else.
I haven't seen bottoms, now I have to see bottoms.
You should,
So,
yeah.
okay, I will.
And theater camp, that's a.
Oh, I
Theater
really
camp.
want to
It's
see
been a
that.
good,
I really
it's been a good
wanna
comedy
see
summer.
that.
Theater
It's
camp.
nice, because I feel like the American comedies have kind of taken a break, but this summer it's been pretty good.
But so, first though, I have to tell a story.
Oh, I'm glad you asked.
Because, so here's what happens when you know, I've admired Tom for a really long time. Actually, the first couple of years that I read was Little Children when it came out. And I confess that I never read Election because I saw the movie. You know, so, but the question, Tom and I were brought together for dinner delightfully a couple of months ago when a friend that we had in common came from New York to visit me, wanted to see Tom. And so I invited Tom and Mary for dinner, and that was delightful, except when I almost choked.
Oh,
It was embarrassing. But we were, Tom and I were trying to figure out when did we meet, because here's what happens with other writers. You intersect at book festivals, you know, at various things, and so you and I know that we had that hilarious
Yes.
Tucson Book Festival, that guy AJ Finn. And by the way, I noticed that there was someone named somebody Finn.
Oh,
in,
wow.
in, did you notice that? I thought it was kind of.
Yeah, I
Is
just.
that the author of the
Oh,
postmodern
yes.
book? I thought maybe you were having a little fun.
I
with
wasn't,
that.
but I really was right.
So, you know, Tom and I were kind of, you know, dramatically upstaged by this very flamboyant writer that we were on stage. And we sat in the hot sun in Tucson for book signing. You and I sat at this table, and like 3 people came, and that guy had like a line winding around the block. And at one point he said, "Can we just leave?" I said, "Yeah, I think we can just leave now." And we left. But, and then I was thinking, there was a time, another time that you and I intersected, but I finally remembered when we met. Do you remember?
I don't.
Because now I do, and this is actually a pretty funny story. So, this is more than 10 years ago. I got a call from a producer at WGBH, Channel 2, saying that he was choosing some authors. It was a holiday show to recommend books for people to buy at the holidays. And I was going to be on the show with 2 other writers, and we would each recommend, we had to sort of do a speed recommendation of 3 or 4 books. And so it was on this show, I'm not going to name names, but a woman who has a show on Channel 2, kind of a cultural, political show.
Oh, yes.
And so, anyway, I show up, I go into the green room, and one of the other writers is Tom, and I'm like, yay, I get to meet Tom Perrotta. I mean, I was actually a little starstruck. And the 3rd writer was Claire Cook, who had written this book called Must Love Donuts. Mm-hmm. And so we're sitting in there, and first the host had the movie critics go in, and this is when Wesley Morris, I think was his name, still wrote for the Globe. Mm-hmm. So she had the Boston movie guys on, and we're in the green room, and we're watching her interview them about what are the movies that you must see this holiday season, and we're sitting with our books in our lap, like good little school children, because the books go last, and we all go out, and her makeup is being adjusted, and they sit us in the chairs around her. And I remember that I wanted to say to her, thank you so much for inviting me. She just was ignoring us. She was like talking to the people. We're sitting there. So then, before we were allowed to introduce our books, first she was going to have the bookseller at Brookline Booksmith recommend their favorite books. So we watched this on a television monitor while we're sitting there. And so the bookseller says, well, she starts with maybe children's books or something. And then she says, and now, she said, I'm, going to tell you my favorite fiction titles. At which point, the host of the show says, because we're not on camera, God, I hate fiction, it's so boring. Oh, that means history and biography. And you and I Tracy, and then the Brookline Smith bookseller gets to the history and biographies, and our hostess is leading, yes, that one. And we're just, and then all of a sudden it's like, okay, you're live. And she's like, well, hello, I'm here with Tom Perrotta and Julie Blasson, whoever they are. I mean, she doesn't say that. You realize she had nothing to do with choosing us. Her producers chose us. Where, like, I mean, I still remember the books I recommended, but that was amazing. Like, you know, and then off we went, and I remember I went home, and my parents had been watching, and my father called and said, you need a different haircut. Wow, that was amazing. That's when we met.
Yes, I do remember that now.
It's when I remember that.
Well, sometimes it's good to be humbled.
I think we get the last one.
Yes.
You guys like fiction, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a very impartial audience. So question.
No, I'm glad you cleared that up.
It was such a relief, you know, it's like, yes, got it. So, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just curious. You were talking about the character had some ambiguity around, and you seemed pleased by that, I guess, because it's an interesting thing to have people you have a take on what you thought you were maybe conveying about the character, and the readers then kind of read something different into it or saw it a different way. Is that something that you'll think about intentionally in the future in writing a character, or do you think it just naturally comes about when you're writing?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that, to be truthful, part of what was happening is that I don't, you know, I'm as telepathic as a turnip. You know, I don't believe in ghosts, I don't believe in the Loch Ness Monster. I mean, I wish I did. I'm a very empirical person, which is funny to say because I write fiction and make stuff up. But I write very realistically, and yet I was intrigued by the thought that, and maybe it was part of writing about a world that isn't here yet, but I wanted to imagine as realistically as possible that, you know, what if there are sort of scrims between reality and imagined unknown realities that might exist, that people that are, I wanted to flirt with that. But I felt that if, for instance, I had created a de facto mermaid, I would have been being dishonest to myself because I don't believe in that. But what do I know? You know, what do I actually know? So I imagined what it might be like. Also, what is it like to fall in love with someone who appears to be one thing and then begins to present something else? And in a way, it's a metaphor, right? You fall deeply and perhaps foolishly in love with someone, and you become, you know, up to here with that person, and then, but you don't really know that person. So, you know, what dimensions, what shadows of that person do you begin to see that you realize I am in over my head, and how do I get out?
What was it earlier? You said smart people that do dumb things or something like that. Probably love is one of the top drivers of that.
Money, love, real estate, all
Love and greed.
Do you ever create situations of ambiguity where you don't mind if the reader has different?
Well, I was about to say, I mean, so when I was in the writer's room for The Leftovers, you know, so in The Leftovers, there's this rapture-like event, and 2% of the world's population disappears, and in the book, that's the only supernatural event. As soon as that happens, then people are living in history, and they're just trying to make sense of this thing that happened and the grief that they feel, but when we started to make it as a TV show, David Lindelof, the showrunner, was very insistent, like, okay, this thing happened, now other supernatural things can happen, and ultimately the show went pretty far afield, like way farther than the book did. But my role in the room was to say, like, I don't care how far we go, as long as we create enough ambiguity that there is some kind of potentially rational explanation. And sometimes that rational explanation could be this character is mentally ill and having a hallucination, or sometimes it's, you know, that person ingested a hallucination, you know, whatever it might be, you know. We ultimately, I think, broke that rule once or twice, but that was like just a constant.
But you agreed to it. I mean,
Yes, eventually. I fought the whole first season. I fought against it.
Really?
And then once we moved beyond the book, which was in season 2 and 3, I learned to trust Damon because he was such an interesting storyteller, and I realized that there were, you know, when you have a TV show, you've got to keep generating stories. Like, you know, felt like, oh, maybe it doesn't help to put these like really strict limits around what kind of stories we can tell. But I really wanted to be clear that, you know, what was really important about the idea of the leftovers is it's an inexplicable event, and I just wanted to hold on to that sense that, you know, because if you do, I've seen shows like this, you know, if you get too wild and anything can happen, then nothing has any weight, really.
right.
You know, and then it's just sort of you know, it's just kind of a playground, and play is fun, and it's fun to tell a wild story. But I felt like, no, there's something at stake here. It's like people are trying to make sense of their world, and the world is refusing to make sense. And that to me is like the beginning of religion. You know, it's
Yes.
like what happens when we can't know? You know, we make up stories, and so it was just that I just was insisting on the unknowability of the event. You know, and so it just was like a 3-year process where I had to be that guy, you know.
Such a great cast too.
You know what really, you know, I am not religious. I call myself a mournful atheist, because it wouldn't be nice. But there's a really, really fascinating book by, God, I'm going to say it's Comtoybean, how do you pronounce his name? Called The Testament of Mary. And it's about Christ's mother and her. Have you read it?
No, I haven't.
Well, also it was turned into a monologue on Broadway or off-Broadway show. He wrote it more than a dozen years ago. And so it's a slim novel, but it's at her account of the disciples handling her as he becomes the figure that he is, and her, you know, obviously her fear at what's going to become of her son, who in this book is, you know, this radical kind of activist figure, and the fear is that she will somehow interfere with what is, and so the disciples are monitoring her. You know, she has to be present, but she has to be, it's a really haunting book. And so, you know, there's nothing supernatural in that book. And psychologically, it's absolutely fascinating.
You know, in your book, one of the things is Issa doesn't have a navel, correct?
Right.
But then you're the one who offers there's a plastic surgery procedure.
Okay, so I've actually been asked about this a lot. Okay, so the architect starts, you know, dating her, and there's this kind of, you know, lascivious guy at the architecture firm who's always wanting to like send him off to Bangkok when he gets sent to the Middle East to do some project. He's like, babe, I got the address for you. And all this. And so the architect starts seeing her, and she has no navel. And he asks this, you know, guy at the firm, you ever seen this? And he's like, oh man, you know, are you ever sheltered? This is like a whole thing. So people have said to me, is this a thing? Okay. Oh, wait, is that?
No, I just took your word for it. His word for it.
So here's the weird thing. Some years ago, I was with a friend who is an academic who teaches actually at Western Carolina University, not here. And we were walking through Harvard Square, and it was a warm day, and we walked past, and he said, oh God, there went another one of those. And I said, what? He said, did you see that woman who just passed us? And I said, no. He said, well, she's erased her navel. And I said, what? And he said, well, it's a thing now. That he saw it when his students, and they often, he said, wear, like, you know, to show it, that they've had their navel closed. And I said, why would they do that? And he's like, I don't know, you know, and this was before I taught, you know, and I see a lot of weird things, you know, I'm a teacher, right? But I can't see that. And he said, I don't know. And I said, well, what does it mean? So I was saying, does it mean that you are saying, you know, screw you, Mom? Because it, or, you know, and he said, I don't know, maybe you can have a better tattoo. Maybe you could, you know, so we were just talking about it, but the fact is, I have never seen it. And I don't think he was pulling my leg. I really don't. Knowing him, I don't. I think he meant it, but I haven't seen it, and nobody.
I'm sure Google can solve
Yeah,
this.
we're gonna Google it.
I don't know. So, and that was in the early 2000s. So maybe it's come and gone. This bad, but you know, it was. I didn't make it up. So,
But that was like one of those cases, I think, where you deliberately created ambiguity. Because to me, at first, well, this one doesn't have a navel. That's a good sign that she may be, you know, some kind of unearthly or inhuman anyway.
not a mammal.
Yeah, a creature. But then you do offer through this other character, because I had not heard that this was a common plastic surgery procedure.
Well,
Until I read it in your book.
so I don't know. Maybe I dreamed that.
Create a new trick.
I hope I don't create. I hope I do not create. Lauren.
Yeah, I loved Margot. Margot was my favorite.
Thank you.
And I love her and Mike as sort of a comedic duo, and I love that they had such like fun, like, I don't want to say like, I like the distinctness that they're not romantically involved, but their chemistry is great. And I was wondering, because you mentioned you write a lot about kind of like the domestic and husbands and wives, and I was wondering if there was anything that you look for when you're thinking about like pairing two characters in a couple or sort of a non-couple, and what's fun to sort of unpack for you?
That's an interesting question, and I'm sure it's one you could look at too. I mean, so I've been married twice. I've certainly had some, not a ton of relationships before, and I often reflect on what was good and what was not good about relationships that I had and relationships that I have. I mean, you might outstrip me, but I've been with men I'm with now for 35 years maybe. So there are, and also we've seen couples come together and apart, also in very surprising ways. I have discovered that the couples that when you're in your 20s and 30s you think are the forevers are often exactly not the forevers. And I've learned a lot about illusion in marriages. I mean, you really can't, and this is one of the things that I say to my fiction writing students, who are one, that one of the greatest things that a fiction writer gets to do is go inside a marriage, because nobody outside of marriage, and I mean nobody, no matter how close you are to another couple, I really think you can't see inside, but that's what fiction writers get to do. So I really enjoy that, and playing with different compatibilities and incompatibilities and surprise compatibilities. So Margot and Mike, you know, it's ambiguous at the end what their relationship might become, but I did not want them to become romantically involved. That was a choice that would have been too easy, as they both, you know, lick their wounds and in her case, figure out how could you get revenge on these spouses that have not only left you, but in a very publicly humiliating way. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
You know, I think, you know, when you write about characters and relationships, you know, you just need to think about what these characters want. You know, it's, you know, in the novel anyway, it's often about desire. And you know, sometimes long-term marriages are less about desire, right? And more about like this project that you build together or something. You know, but the origin is desire, you know, what somebody wants from another person and how that person fits in their story. So like in Little Children, Sarah is married, her husband is older. She kind of drifted into this marriage because she was a grad student and felt like she was kind of lost in her 20s, and she met this older man, and he kind of offered her a life, and she took it, and now she's restless within it. But there's also just this buried trauma where she felt like she was never especially attractive, and she meets this really handsome guy, and it's like the first time in her life where like this guy is like, you know, he's trying to escape the confines of his marriage in the sense that he has to be, you know, he's kind of the, not the breadwinner, he's the child care nurturer while his wife makes the money, and so he's looking for a way to kind of rediscover his virility and his you know, the freedom he had when he was younger, and so they're kind of this volatile pair, and they're both just really frustrated in the marriages that they're in, and the other person offers them, at least very temporarily, the chance to live out some different fantasy of themselves.
Right.
You know, and I think that the question, actually, you know, this is one of those writing things that I'm writing it, and there's real chemistry there only because each is providing something the other one needs, right? So that's like the source of the chemistry. But I had to think about it as a writer, like, okay, can these people like actually make it go? Because that's the question that in really the heart of the book. Are they going to run away together? You know? And so every time I would write a scene that suggested like maybe there's something deeper there. Maybe they're getting to know each other, and maybe they're closer to each other than they are to their spouses. But every time I did that, then I would try to write a scene that sort of tugged them apart a little bit. You know? And I just was waiting for my sense of them as a couple to kind of solidify so I could make that decision as a writer. You know, can this last? And I do think that's, you know, that happens with real life
you know,
relationships too.
and so it occurs to me though that in this newest book, you actually write in a couple of characters' lives about male infidelity in a really compassionate way. Both for Vito, the one-time football star, and how he really was the womanizer, and he really screwed over some of his, how many ex-wives, 3 ex-wives or something, and he knows it. But the other one that's so poignant is the principal, Jack Weed, is that his name? And his wife has been sick with cancer for quite a while, and he's, am I giving away too much? No, and he's having this affair with front desk Diane. It's really sweet, but I think probably not the sexiest, but a kind woman who, who's his dependable right-hand person in the office. Because, his wife is very sick, and does that justify infidelity? Maybe not, but the way that's portrayed and the way that plays out, because guess what, the wife gets better. She doesn't die. I'm not spoiling, but it's like what happens then, and that actually really, I shed tears at the outcome of that. So, but you're very compassionate with those men. I mean, they're weak, okay? Maybe not the best choices, but in both cases, the football star and the weedy principal, I understand.
Yeah, well, I think we catch them both not at the height of the affair when they're maybe feeling powerful and like they're getting away with something, but in the moments of aftermath, when they realize they've hurt other people, but also that they have, poisoned their own,
Compromise themselves,
and are no longer as comfortable in the world as they were before, and so, but yes, I don't think it's that interesting to read about somebody who just is sort of, a manipulator or just looking to, maximize their pleasure in life and are really selfish about it. I mean, Vito was that.
Yes, we don't see him.
But we don't even meet him until he's, the sad divorced guy in AA, looking back on the mess he's made of his life.
But for all the bad behavior, these men, they all have a conscience.
Yeah. It's hard to write about people who don't. I mean, those are the real villains, right? I mean,
Right, and sometimes those are necessary to a story. I mean, and then that might often be when you're writing about the person who is harmed by the person without conscience.
Well, I know writing for me, multiple point of view, sometimes it's hard to keep all your characters in check. Sometimes there's a character that feels like the weakest to me. So I guess I'm curious about whether it's the books that most recently come out or any of the books that you guys are reading in your writing career, if there's ever a character that you weren't confident on at first, and if it was difficult to write them, if it was difficult to develop them, if there was any kind of character that just you felt not confident with at first, if that makes sense.
well, so in Little Children, there's a character who is a sex offender, and a child sex offender, and I didn't want him in the book, but he kind of, and it's a really interesting thing when you're writing. He just insisted. It was like when he appeared, and it happened. So we were living in Watertown.
Yeah.
Oh, you remember this?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. And
I remember that guy. There was
Oh,
Yeah.
it's something that came
Well,
in
it was
from your real
like,
life.
he was just, so this is the early, right around the late 90s actually, and it was a time when there was a lot of social anxiety around, some of it well-founded. There were a lot of like notification laws that were started then. So anytime, and the internet was starting to, provide people with information on sex offenders in their neighborhoods. And at this one playground, this guy, where the cops came around and said, there's a sex offender, he just got released, he's not allowed to come within, X hundred yards of schools and playgrounds. So if you see him, call us, because then he's violated his parole and we're gonna put him back in prison where he belongs. So, and one of the dads just got incredibly agitated about this, and he would do like loops around the school just to, on the lookout for this guy. And just in the back of my mind when I was writing Little Children was this sort of anxiety around the presence of child predators and sex offenders. And I was setting Little Children on playgrounds. These two stay-at-home parents who bring their kids to the same playground and the same pool, and they start this affair, and it's sort of happening with their kids around. And at a certain point, I was just stuck, like, what? This isn't enough for a book. It's just like, well, this chapter they get together, this chapter they start an affair, this chapter somebody finds out. It just didn't seem like enough. And then at some point, this other character came in and he was the guy kind of from the playground. And he's just obsessed with the idea that this sex offender has been, released and is around in the community. And, I do close third person in that book, and I switch off from a lot of characters. And I just said, I'm not going to go into his head. I just don't want to go there, And so what I did was describe him either through the eyes of parents who find him to be a monster, or his own mother who he lives with, who loves him. And that creates this sort of dual vision for the thing. If you privilege the mother, you think, oh, maybe he's not so bad, or maybe he's not the monster that the townspeople believe him to be. But at the end of the book, I actually do go into his head. I think I had spent enough time around him and around people thinking about him that I had to do it because he was alone in a scene that I needed to write. But it was probably a year where I was sort of really conflicted in my mind about how to write about a character who I was revolted by, and what are the ethics of that? Because I believe as a fiction writer, I have to understand my characters and inhabit them in some way. But I didn't want to do that, because I had to figure out these workarounds, and then finally I was, and within the scene that I did write, I just stuck to like the surface of the scene, because there were just some logistical, you had to know where he was and what he was up to at a certain moment. But it wasn't like into the darkest recesses of his mind.
Somebody who does that really well is Laura Lippman. She writes, she's a wonderful, she has a detective series, but she also has these, psychological thrillers, and she will write from the point of view of criminals, murderers, and people like that. I'll say and answer your question. Certainly, some of the characters I felt the most satisfied in the end writing about are the ones who scared me or intimidated me the most, that they were necessary, or they surprised me by insisting on being more important than I wanted them to be. And I'll just say one, because in my fourth novel, The Widower's Tale, which is also set in a prosperous Boston area suburb, that was the first year that we had moved from New York, and we were actually living in Lincoln, west of Boston, which is the town that I grew up in, renting a house there. And one day, I woke up in this house we were renting, and the yard was filled with all these workers. And I had just planted these bulbs, whatever, and I could see that they were sort of doing something there, and I went down to speak with them and say, please don't touch this area where and they all looked at me, and they were all, they didn't speak a word of English. And I realized that they were actually, sometimes they were Brazilian crews. I knew that they were all Guatemalan. It's sort of hard to explain why, but I knew they were all Guatemalan. And it just was like very awkward for them. They didn't even have a boss who spoke to me. So I just had to kind of, and I remember speaking to the people who owned our property, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm sorry, we didn't warn you that they were coming to just completely do the lawn, and fine. But I can't think about them. And I'd see these crews working around, and I was writing about, again, this affluent community, and something made me really want to write from the point of view of one of these garden workers. But I created someone who actually had been given an opportunity as a student, and then he sort of he violated his visa. There's kind of a whole backstory. So he ended up being, this undocumented worker in his 20s there who aspires to try to gain, a more secure foothold, become an arborist, and you get his whole story. Now, this was back around 2010, 2012, I think. And there was not an issue about writing in, another ethnic point of view. And this character was actually quite beloved. I wrote in the close third. People love this character. I actually got an email from a friend who's a writer. Partway through his reading the book, he said, if you harm a hair on the head of Celestino, I am coming for you. And I'm like, whoa! So, and of course I had already finished the book, so it was like, thank God, he ends up fine. But, threats to him, both legal and his heart is broken. But that character has stayed with me. Some characters do, and that character comes back, and he's a very important character in Vigil Harbor. But my dilemma was that in this moment, I'm not allowed. In fact, I had to have a conversation with both my agent and my editor, and they said, Julie, we love that character, but you can no longer write from it. Even though you wrote him very well, the times are such that you can't do that. So he is married, and you see him as a guy who's built his business, but now immigration laws are much stricter, and he's terrified, even though he's married to this woman who grew up in Vigil Harbor, and she doesn't completely understand his fear. But he's a very important character to me, and it's funny how many people have read the book and think that they're in his point of view. That's how close I get to him. And again, and that marriage too was for me an interesting thing. When you marry someone you really love, but there's a kind of line you can't cross. You can't fully ever understand the kind of fear that someone like he would have. And then you have a child together, and that child, is going to grow up to be a person of color, and you, the mother, are not. You're white. So the mother's feelings about. But I'll tell you, I had to have the sensitivity reader at my publisher bore down really hard on those sections of the book, and sometimes in ways that I felt like part of what that sensitivity reader didn't understand is the way that spouses think about each other after getting married for a while. She was like, this seems potentially racist to me. And I'm like, no, she's just really mad at him, and she, so anyway, but that's how I got around that. So he's a character that, I had been like, is this character going to be this important? And lo and behold, he came back again. And I've had characters recur in some of my books. And it's always a pleasure when that happens. And I always have to interrogate myself, why am I really doing this? But usually the character stays. So.
I think we're going to have to, if we just hold on 1 second, I'm going to have to stop the live stream. And have to give them an opportunity to sign books so they can keep chatting. But I'm just going to go ahead and let the live stream audience go.
Bye, live stream audience. Thank you so much.
Then, thank you, everybody. And then, we can continue to ask some more questions and get some books signed for people that want to get them signed. Thank you.